This lecture is on the united monarchy, the beginning of, well, David's reign, really. Sources from this period are from the Psalms, a large percentage of which were written by David, from 2 Samuel and from 1 Chronicles. Just a note on Chronicles, it's not just a rehash of Israel's history, it's a post-exilic book, probably written by Ezra or by some other priest, but it doesn't correct the previously written Samuel and Kings. Chronicles brings a focus on the house of the Lord and getting the people ready for the arrival of the temple and of the true temple, Jesus Christ. Okay. 1 Chronicles tells us about David for the purpose of telling us how the temple came to be built. So the form of the revelation in this period, first of all, we have the angel of Yahweh. We also have the word of Yahweh, which, if you've read one of those articles, if you've read that article on the word of Yahweh, seems to be a person rather than just an abstract concept. Okay. The Holy Spirit spoke through David in the Psalms and also to David through the prophets Nathan and Gad in particular. So there seems to be a genuine understanding of God through special revelation, but of course there's also general revelation this period. Psalm 19 speaks about the heavens declaring the glory of God. So God holds David responsible for knowing the content of general revelation, and then of course he speaks to him specifically in special revelation. The people involved are Abiathar in the first part of David's life. He's a representative of the priesthood, and Zadok during Solomon's reign. David, of course, is the main figure. He's the king. Nathan and Gad are prophets, and their ministry was probably not limited to what was recorded. Okay, that they probably spoke to David at other times, but we just have what their messages that are recorded in the Book of Kings. It's through David that the covenant is going to become a reality. The promise of Deuteronomy is going to be fulfilled because David is God's choice. David is from the tribe of Judah, which fulfills that promise given to the tribe of Judah by Jacob. The timing was not right when Saul was chosen. The people weren't ready and God's man wasn't available. David was probably too young at the time when they asked Samuel for a king. But also they asked for the wrong reasons. They asked for a king so they would be like the other nations, and it was never God's intention for them to be like the other nations. He intended them to be different so that people looking at the lifestyle of the Israelites would say, we want what they've got. That they would live in a way that showed the world what it was like to live in obedience to God and under his blessing. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we see that Samuel's sons turned out to be bad, but God did not hold Samuel responsible as he did Eli. Because the only example of fatherhood that Samuel had was, in fact, Eli. He lived in Eli's home from the time he was a very young child. However, what this does tell us is that parents are responsible to teach their children the right way. When the children make wrong choice, they are responsible themselves. God's complaint against Eli was that he didn't instruct his sons. At the beginning, Saul doesn't seem to want to be king. He seems initially to have had the right spirit of humility, but his physical bearing gave the appearance of a leader. He was tall and he was good looking. And the people looked at him and thought, wow, here's a king we can be proud of. David was the exact opposite. David was young. He was apparently good looking, but he's just a young man. And he was so unimpressive, apparently, that even his father forgot that he was out there looking after the sheep. When Samuel asked to see all of Jesse's sons, he left David out. And it was only when Saul asked, isn't there any more, that they kind of went, oh yeah, there's David, he's out there. So apparently, at least when he was anointed, he was still fairly unimpressive. Saul was God's choice at the demand of the people. The people wanted a king like the other nations, and God gave them a king like the other nations. They were more ready to accept the man than they were to accept God's will concerning the timing. The emphasis should have been on Israel as God's inheritance, but at the end of his life, Saul seems to consider Israel as his inheritance. He takes upon himself roles which he was not entitled to. So he claimed more than was legitimately his. In 1 Samuel 13, we find he takes upon himself the role of the priesthood, and in 1 Samuel 15, he decides what is good. Even though God has said to destroy all the Amalekites, he saves the king and some, and blames the people for saving the best of the animals. Okay. Saul's reign and its outcome teaches us that God alone has authority over his inheritance. In chapters 13 to 15, Saul blames the people. There's an emphasis on the action of the people and how it impacts Saul. Okay, Saul seems to be more afraid of the people than he is of God, and that puts him in a dangerous place. God does say through Samuel that if Saul had been obedient, then he would have had an eternal kingdom, and a kingdom that lasts forever. And we might ponder this and think, well, how could that have been? Because Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was never really supposed to be the legitimate king. The kings were supposed to come from the tribe of Judah, and all the messianic promises indicate that the king will be from the tribe of Judah. But if we think about it clearly, we realise that actually David's first wife was Saul's daughter. And if Saul had been obedient and taught his daughter obedience to God, she wouldn't have despised David and become barren. In that case, Saul's grandchildren would have been David's children. Or I should say it the other way around. David's children would have been Saul's grandchildren, and Jesus would have been the descendant of both David and Saul. So the end result of his disobedience in chapter 13 is that his kingdom only lasts for his lifetime. However, and so the judgment is future. However, in chapter 15, when he disobeys a second time, his disobedience results in present judgment. And so the message from these chapters really is that the king who's anointed by God must rule in obedience to God, because his choice is God's choice, and he's been anointed by Yahweh. He's to be obedient. So again, we hear right throughout the scripture that the key is to obey. Obviously, the Hebrew word for obey is actually from exactly the same root as to hear. That's true in the Greek also. So it's really assumed that hearing God's voice means you will obey. God said to Saul that the best of the Amalekites was not good enough for him. But Saul takes it upon himself to redefine what is good. He was taking authority upon himself rather than allowing God to define what is good. Disobedience changes things, and in this case, Saul is still king, but he's only king in form. God is no longer part of his reign. In chapter 13, Samuel points out that God is looking for a man after God's own heart. And in Acts 13, Paul refers to this and says it refers to David. So when we look at David, we see this is a man after God's own heart. Now, we also see he's not perfect, obviously. There's an interesting kind of complication in the chronology between chapters 16 and 17. David was anointed king, and then he continues to look after his father's sheep. And it appears that When the evil spirit comes upon Saul, his servants suggest that somebody playing the harp for him when he is disturbed by this spirit would kind of soothe him, and one of the servants in particular refers to David as a man who's capable, who worships God, who plays the harp, who would soothe Saul. But he also at that point says that David is a warrior. And it tells us that David was brought into Saul's service, that he played the harp for him, and that he became Saul's armor bearer. Then we get into chapter 17. This is the story of David and Goliath. We're all familiar with that. But at the end of the whole battle, where David has killed Goliath, Saul turns to Abner, the head of Israel's army, and says, "Whose father is that young man?" So it appears that Saul doesn't know who David is. And Abner doesn't know either. Well, if David was already Saul's armor bearer, both Abner and Saul would know who he was. And so there seems to be an out of order chronology here. And the question is, why would the author of Samuel want to put this whole picture of David worshipping, playing the harp, soothing Saul, before the picture in chapter 17 of the shepherd who is actually able to destroy the Philistine? And the answer to that question seems to be that the author of Samuel wanted us to meet David first of all as a worshipper. Because when the servant of Saul points out that this young man can play the harp, he also says he's a warrior. So that seems to suggest to us that David must have killed Goliath before he came into Saul's service as the harp player and then became his armor bearer. But the author of Samuel wants us to meet David first as a worshipper. And so he puts that information about him first, and then secondly as a warrior. David sees himself as a servant. He refers to himself as your servant before Saul, even though he was already anointed as king. We don't see anywhere in Scripture where Saul refers to himself as a servant. But David continues to see himself as a servant even after having been anointed as king. David also sees himself as a shepherd, and he tells Saul that it was as a shepherd protecting his father's sheep that he learned how to kill the lion and the bear, and that he's going to be able to kill the Philistine in the same way. God is seen as shepherd in Isaiah 40, and of course David's famous Psalm 23 understands God as his shepherd in his own personal experience. Saul was never a shepherd, nor was he a servant. In fact, he even set up a monument in his own honour, we read in chapter 15, verse 12. So David is a worshipper, he's a servant, he's a shepherd. He gives complete credit for his success to God. He was totally dependent on God even to be a good shepherd. He says that the God who helped him to kill the lion and the bear will help him to kill the Philistine. Saul has the authority of a king. He has all the whole army of Israel at his disposal. But he and the whole army are terrified. It is the servant and the shepherd who defeats Goliath. David was a true shepherd who would risk his own life for a lamb. And the true shepherd will be more concerned with the protection of the sheep. The Philistines were finally defeated and deliverance came through David, because David was a true shepherd. He was a shepherd of Israel, and he understood that it was his job to risk his life to protect the people. Even though Saul was still king, he was king in name only. He didn't have the ability or the authority of the king, and he was finally conquered by the Philistines, the enemies of God. Saul does not seem to have any part in the covenant relationship with God. Notice in 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 11, it tells us that Saul was among the prophets, or it asks that question, is Saul among the prophets? And in chapter 19, verse 24, we have the same question. a similar kind of incident and the same question. This indicates that the chapters between 10 and 19 are what we call an inclusio. In between chapter 10 and chapter 19, Saul comes to the throne, disobeys and loses it, and he begins to chase David. Before this, Samuel is rejected by the people, but after it, David is rejected by Saul. And in between is the story of the rise and fall of a man whom God would have used if he had been capable of covenant relationship. In 1 Samuel 19, when we read that second reference to is Saul among the prophets, God strips Saul of his outer glory and he lies naked before God. So David was anointed by Samuel, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. At the same time, the Spirit of the Lord left Saul, and God sent an evil spirit. Rather than just demon possession, this seems to be an act of God's judgment. Left to himself, Saul ends up opposing God's plan for Israel. He's no longer capable of ruling Israel, and in fact, instead of fighting the Philistines and bringing deliverance to Israel, which is what was expected of him, he wastes his time running around chasing David. The coming of the Spirit of the Lord upon David is identified with the enabling required to lead Israel. The anointing of God is not for individual glory. It's for the enabling of an individual God requires to fulfill God's will. If that is not the focus, it becomes self-destructive. It did with Samson, and it does with Saul. David was anointed 3 times. In 1 Samuel 16, he's anointed by Samuel. In 2 Samuel 2, verse 4, he's anointed to be king over Judah, over the tribe of Judah. And then in 2 Samuel 5, verse 3, he's anointed to be king over all Israel at Hebron. In Jerusalem. The writer of 1 and 2 Samuel seems to be trying to draw attention to the fact that David was the Lord's anointed. It's 10 times where he's called the anointed of the Lord. This identifies David as a special individual who's going to carry out God's purposes and his will. So in a special way, David becomes a Messiah, an anointed one. So first comes the announcement by Samuel that David is going to be in the place of Saul. Second, the recognition of the elders of the tribe of Judah at Hebron. And then third, 7 years later, recognition of all Israel. So in this way, the writer of 1 Samuel shows us that he is a forerunner of the Messiah. He's a type, if you like. Now, he's not a perfect type because he does sin. But 2 Samuel chapter 7 is where God announces his covenant with David. And this gives us a focus of something greater than mere kingship in David's life. It becomes clear he cannot be the Messiah, but he is a Messiah. He's the beginning of a new thing in Israel's history. The covenant made with him is going to last forever. There is an additional aspect in the covenant relationship. David's son will be on the throne forever. It's a specialization of the Abrahamic covenant. This is the first time a particular family out of the descendants of Abraham has been the focus of the covenant promises. So looking at the Davidic covenant, how it's stated in 1 Samuel chapter 7. We have 2 ideas, the basis and the content of the covenant. The basis of the Davidic covenant is that it is monergistic. It's based on what God does, not on what David did. David is a shepherd, and that keeps him out of the mainstream of life. God recognizes the shepherd and servant heart, which is the characteristic of a man who can lead Israel. When we read verses 9 following, note the I wills. Actually, even in the Hebrew text, there's a separate pronoun in verse 8, and it's followed by consecutive perfect rendition of the verb, meaning the emphasis is on God in the first instance, and the verbs maintain that emphasis. All that David has to do is obey, but obedience is absolutely necessary. Psalm 132 is significant. O Lord, remember David and all the hardships he endured. He swore on oath to the Lord and made a vow to the Mighty One of Jacob. I will not enter my house or go to my bed. I will allow no sleep to my eyes, no slumber to my eyelids, till I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling for the Mighty One of Jacob. We heard it in Ephrathah. We came upon it in the fields of Jair. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool. Arise, O Lord, and come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. May your priests be clothed with righteousness. May your saints sing for joy. For the sake of David your servant, do not reject your anointed one. The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath that he will not revoke. One of your own descendants I will place on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on your throne forever and ever. For the Lord has chosen Zion, he has desired it for his dwelling. This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant blessings. Her poor will I satisfy with food. I will clothe her priests with salvation, and her saints will ever sing for joy. Here I will make a horn grow for David, and set up a lamp for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but the crown on his head will be resplendent. The emphasis in Psalms 120 to 134 is on the temple. These psalms were arranged in Hezekiah's time. 701 BC was the siege of Jerusalem by Sennacherib and Hezekiah's prayer in the temple. There was a crisis in Jerusalem, and there was a cry for the fulfillment of the covenant. Psalm 132 is the plea for God to remember the promises he made to David. Note particularly verse 11, which says, the Lord swore an oath to David, one of your own descendants I'll place on the throne. And in verse 12, if your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on your throne forever and ever. Okay. Obedience was absolutely necessary, regardless of the circumstances, for the covenant to be a real part of Israel's experience with God. David is obviously human and thus not fit to be the Messiah, but he is a type of the Messiah, and he reveals some of the aspects of the true Messiah. Obedience is necessary both for the king and for the people. So looking at the content of the Davidic covenant, there are four characteristics of the Davidic covenant. Firstly, it did not abrogate any of the previous covenants. The Edenic, Noachian, Abrahamic, and Mosaic covenants are all still in place, and the Davidic covenant is built on top of them. It's unconditional in its intention. It's not based on legal obedience. If the descendants of David don't fulfill the obedience requirement, they will be crossed off, but God's covenant will continue. Individuals who disobey are set aside, but that doesn't change the covenant. God will correct those who turn aside, but he'll never take the covenant away from the line of David. Thirdly, the fact that David will never have to worry about his seed being on the throne because God is going to do it. This is a new part of the covenant. And then fourthly, the covenant centered around building a house. David's concern is that any kingdom of value in that time had a temple for their God. If Yahweh is the only true God, greater than the gods of the other nations, then he should have a temple to declare his greatness. David's concern is an earthly kingdom through which God will be glorified. It probably appears that David gets this idea from his culture. However, God's concern is more interested in building a kingdom rather than a temple or a house of worship. God wants to build his kingdom. David wants to build a house for God, but Nathan comes with the message that God will build a house for David. The house of David will be built before a house for God can be built. God's kingdom is more important to God than temple building. I find it interesting, and I've thought this, I haven't come to any conclusion yet, but I suspect that the temple wasn't actually necessary. I mean, the tabernacle was designed according to the pattern that Moses received on the mountain, and it was functioning still in David's day. People could worship at the tabernacle. And God, when David says, I want to build a house for God to dwell in, God's complaint is, I don't dwell in houses made by hands. I've never asked anybody to build me a temple. And so, but David was God's friend, and David wanted to do this. And so there is the suspicion here that God included the temple in his plans because it was in David's heart. Now, I can't say that for sure. God gave the plans for the temple to Solomon, but it was David whose desire it was to build the temple, and he provided the materials necessary and the site for the temple in the end. Psalm 127 speaks about, unless the Lord build the house, it's speaking about a family here. This part of the covenant is going to be kept and fulfilled by God through the family. There's a relationship between the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants. So let's have a look at that. The inheritance of the land is in the Abrahamic covenant. It's re-emphasized, it's stated first in Genesis 12, re-emphasized in Genesis 13. But God says he will fulfill the matter of the land as a part of this covenant also in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10, and also verses in Psalm 37. Secondly, a great name. This is promised to Abraham in chapter 12 and 17 in Genesis, and to David in the new covenant, this Davidic covenant in chapter 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 9. David probably did not fully understand what this meant. Inheritance, other than the land actually, in 2 Samuel 7:10, he's promised a place of rest and security. The whole surrounding area will recognize David's power and authority, and Solomon's, until Solomon's disobedience sets in. Fourthly, there's the promise of seed, singular, one. So this doesn't apply to all of David's descendants. It also doesn't apply to all of Abraham's descendants in Genesis chapter 17, verses 7 to 10. Although it's initially applied to Isaac, it actually applies to the one who will come, the one who's both the seed of Abraham and the seed of David, which of course is Jesus himself. The covenant results in a relationship between God and David's seed. The seed is now singular, it's a specific person, it's focused on a son. Fifthly, the seed is called my son. God is the one who will establish the relationship. And then 6, we find that we have the same tripartite formula that we had in the Abrahamic covenant. I shall be their God, and they will be my people, and I will dwell in the midst of them. A seventh characteristic is the uniqueness of God and his people. This is an important theme of the Mosaic Code, particularly in Numbers 14:12 and Deuteronomy 33, verses 26 and 29. But it's mentioned here in the Davidic covenant in chapter 7, verse 22. Kings will descend from you as a promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:2 and 17:6, and it's reiterated to David in chapter 7, verse 13. The blessing of the Lord is something that is stated in Genesis chapter 12 in the Abrahamic covenant. Abraham will bless to be a blessing. The same thing applies to the Davidic covenant, 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 29. The way it's stated here is generally translated into English, sovereign Lord. It translates to two Hebrew words, Adonai and Yahweh. And it seems to emphasize the fact of God's sovereignty, but also his relationship character. Remember, Yahweh is the name for the relation the covenant relationship God. There also seems to be an intentional tie here between the Abrahamic and Davidic covenants with the use of that name. Both covenants are eternal. Genesis 17:7 for the Abrahamic, 2 Samuel 7:13 for the Davidic. And David takes a special note of this in his reply when he replies to God. So we see that the Davidic seed is going to receive the promises, but there's nothing to indicate that the seed will mediate the promises. The Messiah will mediate the blessing and the promise, but not of the seed of Abraham or David. God keeps the mediatorial right for himself. Hence, even though David appoints Solomon as successor, and it seems to be in agreement with God's choice, David only appoints at God's direction. Only God chooses who will ascend the throne. Confusion and trouble result when men take it into their own hands to appoint the successor. God speaks about David as his servant, and in David's response, David refers to himself as God's servant 8 or 9 times. It seems like that's David's favourite statement about himself, that he's God's servant. Now, how did the psalmists, other than David, consider and understand the Davidic covenant? Well, if we look at the outline of the Psalms, it's kind of parallel to the Pentateuch. Book 1, the emphasis in the Psalms 1 to 41, which is book 1 of the Psalms, is creation, and that parallels Genesis. In book 2, Psalms 42 to 72, the emphasis is on deliverance and redemption, and this parallels Exodus. Book 3 is Psalms 73 to 89, and that focuses on the temple, and that seems to parallel Leviticus. Book 4 is Psalms 90 to 106, speaks often of the provision of God in the wilderness, and this parallels Numbers. Then book 5, the final Psalms from 107 to 150, looks back in remembrance and with gratitude to God, and that seems to be what's happening in Deuteronomy, parallel. Of course, there are other ways to subdivide the Psalms. We can look at laments, royal psalms, psalms of praise, imprecatory psalms, thanksgiving, etc. But some scholars say this type of subdivision takes the Psalms out of their context. We will look at them in those terms, obviously, because it's easier than trying to find a context for every psalm. But just a note on the royal psalms. Some of them are individual and they're private psalms written by David. Some of them are corporate and they're for the public because David is God's representative. So, in the royal psalms, the Davidic son in these psalms is identified as God's son who is living in Zion. He's ruling for God from God's city, Zion, which is in the vicinity of Jerusalem. Mount Zion is one of the mountains in Jerusalem. The Davidic king is a representative of God to the people, but he also represents people to God, so he has a certain priestly role as well. Some theologians look on all the Psalms as though they're all messianic in nature, but we have to be careful when we read them as to whether they refer to David and how many of them refer to the Messiah, of whom David is only a forerunner. Psalm 2 is obviously a royal psalm, but in the Davidic covenant, every king was seen as a son of God, and each one is a son by covenant relationship. But this son's influence is going to extend to the ends of the earth. There's metaphorical and poetic language here, and the psalm speaks of the Messiah, Jesus, through the covenant relationship of the king. Jesus is in focus in this psalm as he is the final result and fulfillment of the Davidic covenant. Okay, the writer of this psalm, no doubt, did not know about Jesus because it was written a long time before Jesus was born. However, these Psalms 1 and 2 are an introduction to the whole Psalter, and they may have been written in the post-exilic period as a kind of introduction to the whole book of Psalms. Psalm 89 seems to be compiled out of 2 psalms put together. It sounds like a royal psalm at the beginning, but it finishes up as a lament. We're told that Ethan the Ezrahite was the author of the psalm, but we don't know who he was. So we don't know what historical event it refers to. In this psalm, there's no present evidence of a king or a continuing covenant. But verse 37 emphasises God's faithfulness, and it applies to God himself and addresses his total dependability. Often used in this psalm to refer to those whom God blesses also. God is faithful, but those whom God blesses are also faithful. Then also it uses the term chesed, which we usually translate loving kindness, but it's such a big word, it can mean all sorts of things: grace, favour, faithfulness, loyalty, and so on. The free acts of rescue or deliverance, which include God's faithfulness, are in focus here. The loving kindness of God is directly related to the Davidic covenant because it's because of God's kindness and his love for David that he makes this covenant that will be eternal and will be fulfilled in his Son. But of course, God's faithfulness is only available to those who are faithful to God's covenant. So this Psalm 89 is written by one of the faithful, questioning the evidence of God's faithfulness. Honesty with God is seen here clearly, as it is in many of the Psalms. And so we see in the Psalms a clear evidence of covenant relationship. There were those in Israel, David as a great representative, but others too, who wrote Psalms, whose faith in God and relationship with God is an intimate relationship in which they are able to be honest and straightforward before God, even with their complaints. And that is part of covenant relationship.